Hello everyone, my name is Ayse. I'm a fourth-year PhD student in Professor Zoltan Naja's group at Purdue. In this presentation, I will walk you through an experimental proof-of-concept study on a wet mill integrated cooling crystallization process of a commercial pharmaceutical ingredient. Crystallization is the particle formation and purification step of active pharmaceutical ingredients in almost all the industrial processes. Here, you see a typical pharmaceutical process for tablet production, with crystallization step highlighted as the final step before downstream processes. And it has been shown in several studies the product crystals from this step highly affect the downstream processes such as filtration or tableting due to their bulk properties such as compressibility or flowability. In addition to manufacturability, crystal properties also determine the bioavailability and product uniformity. That is why intensification of and having tight control over crystallization processes are crucial to meet critical quality attributes in an optimum way. In this work, we focused on size and especially shape control of a commercial API with high aspect ratio, aiming to produce low aspect ratio crystals with uniform size distribution and a certain bulk density. There are a couple ways to manipulate and control the crystal shape, as shown here. The first one is the temperature profile. Although temperature profile can be effective on size manipulation, most of the time it is not the best method to change the aspect ratio or crystal shape significantly. Another option is using growth rate modifiers, but this can be tricky with commercial drug, and it is not always available depending on the physicochemical properties. Another method, and what we used in this work, is using mechanical force to change the size and shape of the crystals. This is the easiest method to be used, but generally needs a methodological study to decide on at which step and how to benefit from crystal breakage optimally during the process. Luckily, our postdoc Botond had already published a detailed work on the optimum operation of wet mill integrated cooling crystallization processes last year. In this work, he worked on 3 different configurations, as shown here: only crystallizer, internal or immersion wet mill and crystallizer, and the crystallizer with external wet mill. The results of this model-based work demonstrated that the best target satisfaction was achieved by external milling configuration, which was tightly followed by internal mill configuration. The optimum usage of wet mill for shape control was determined to be an on and off fashion at the beginning of the cooling profile. Then implementing a small temperature cycle to heal the crystals while the mill was still on until the halfway of this heating time to ensure the shape change. After this part, any temperature profile could be implemented based on the need. Since the usage of internal mill is much easier for eliminating the pump and transfer lines and was shown to be as good as the external wet mill, we adapted this configuration in our experimental study. This is our typical lab-sized batch crystallization setup, and here you can see the internal wet mill integrated in the system. We also utilized all the PAT tools we have, such as UV for concentration data acquisition, FPRM for crystal count, and particle view to detect the crystallization mechanism during experiments, as our inline PAT tools. Offline tools were also used for particle size and shape characterization. The crystals of the commercial API we have, so-called compound A, is shown here in 2 pictures. As seen, they form high aspect ratio crystals. On the left, you see the product crystals after several temperature cycling, while on the right, you see the crystals right after nucleation. It is apparent that they change their size and shape significantly during the batch process with temperature cycles, and our aim was to decrease the aspect ratio of these crystals while maintaining their bulk properties, as these thicker crystals on the left have. For this purpose, and by following the model-based work I just presented, we designed 8 different experiments to compare the effects of temperature cycle number and wet mill usage. In addition, we also replaced the seeding, which is the fundament of industrial crystallization of this compound, with in situ seed generation by benefiting from the internal wet mill. Here in this table, you see the naming for these experiments and the process parameters we changed. The numbers at the beginning correspond to the cycle number, and the letter M corresponds to the wet mill usage. We also repeated in situ seed generation experiment to show product consistency and this method's robustness and reproducibility in eliminating the uncertainty due to primary nucleation. Here on the right, you see the temperature cycles forming our temperature profile for these experiments. Temperature, total crystal count, and chord length profiles of all the experiments are shown on this slide. On the left, you see the experiments without wet mill, while the middle panel shows the experiments with internal mill. On the right, unseeded experimental data is shown. At the first glance, the effects of temperature cycles in the milled and non-milled experiments can be observed by the mean chord length trends, which is shown with the black line. The mean chord length almost doubles when the temperature cycles are implemented compared to the linear cooling experiment, and the total count decreases upon dissolving the small crystals and making them redeposit onto remaining big ones. In the unseeded experiments, the primary nucleation was triggered in two different ways. The slight difference between these experiments is the extra cycle implemented in the top experiment at the beginning with fast cooling and heating to trigger nucleation and then to drive the system to the same starting point as milled and multiple cycled experiments. In the second experiment, instead of waiting for system to nucleate by itself, we started milling from the very beginning, and the shear stress from the mill was enough to trigger primary nucleation during the first cycle. The chord length and the crystal count trends from both experiments show that the consistency of the unseeded experiments were realized. Here, the boxes show the wet mill usage during these experiments. When we look at the product crystal's length and width distributions from milled and non-milled experiments, we immediately see that the production of consistent crystals with narrow size distribution is realizable with milling and temperature cycling. On the left, the significant effect of increasing temperature cycle number on the crystal size is significant, while this effect was dominated by the milling done at the beginning of each experiment. Yet, the crystals could grow up to 200 micrometer in length. Temperature cycles help decrease aspect ratio a little since they also promote width growth, but implementing only the temperature cycles was not enough to decrease aspect ratio as desired. Here on the top left, the aspect ratio distribution of the crystals from linear cooling experiment without milling, 3 times cycled experiment without milling, and 3 times cycled and milled experiments are shown. As seen, the aspect ratio of the product crystals from milled and 3 times cycled experiment could be decreased even further than the seed crystals, although the crystals could be grown. The microscopy images on the right also provide qualitative evidence of this improvement. We also use laser scattering technique to measure the volume-based size distributions of all the product crystals, and the trends of the results also show that more consistent production was achieved with milling while having more uniform size distributions and maintaining the desired crystal growth. This was also reflected on manufacturability properties such as bulk density and compressibility. Bulk density and tap density were increased with increasing temperature cycle numbers. In addition to this, milling also improved the bulk density values of the product. Even the crystals from in situ seed generation experiment had bulk densities above the desired value of 0.25. Even last but not least, the compressibility percentage of the crystals was decreased significantly by implementing the mill with or without seeding compared to the unmilled and multiple cycled experiments. This also implies that the flowability of the crystals was improved, which is generally preferred in industry for downstream process efficiency. So in this work, we demonstrated the positive effects of wet mill integration in thermocycle crystallization experiments of a commercial pharmaceutical ingredient. This proof of concept study was based on a previous model-based optimization work on wet mill integrated systems, and results demonstrated that the model-based guidance indeed provided an optimum solution and improved the crystal size and shape properties as desired, while maintaining desired bulk properties. As our future work, we want to investigate more on optimization of wet mill usage during thermocycled experiments. For this purpose, we already started the parameter estimation calculations of the model of the system by using the experimental data shown in this presentation. With that, I would like to thank my advisor, Professor Nash, my postdoc, Botond, for paving the way for this study and actually providing a very good starting point. Also, to Dr. Kohn and Dr. Papageorgiou from Takeda for their valuable support and feedback. Thank you for your attention.